Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Recently Read. This week I'm going to be reviewing Argo, how the CIA and Hollywood pulled off the most audacious rescue in history by Antonio Mendez. Antonio Mendez is a former CIA agent who wrote this book on which the film produced and directed by Ben Affleck is based on. This continues on a theme that I've been covering for the last few weeks, which is the theme of Iran in the wake of the fall of the Shah and the rise of the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is very much it wasn't planned this way, but this is very much very much in the news today, because of the number of protests that are taking place right now in Iran, and also with the suppression of these protests, the violent suppression of these protests by the current regime. That was completely and totally unplanned. My coverage of Iran and my interest in Iran was sort of just my own interest in the region of the Middle East. As I've mentioned before, one of my masters is in the history and archaeology of Western Asia, and that covers the region from Turkey and Cyprus all the way to Central Asia, so the Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan and all the stans, and of course Iran kind of falls in the middle of this. The first book that I covered was Reading Lolita in Tehran, which is a book that I've been wanting to read for many years, and I finally picked it up. The second book in this series, you could say, is The King of Kings, The Fall of the Shah, and now the third book in the series is Argo. This is an interesting book because while Reading Lolita in Tehran sort of covers or looks at Iran from the perspective of this one individual's experience as a woman and a professor in Iran, and what she went through in the wake of the fall of the Shah and the rise of the Islamic Republic. The second book, The King of Kings, focuses more on the king of Iran, Mohammad Reza, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and his reign as king, and then his eventual fall as king. This book touches on probably one of the most well-known events of the transition and the revolution in Western minds. So that's the Iran hostage crisis. I would say there's probably two major events that people remember very clearly, at least Westerners, if you lived through that period of time, and if you've maybe even done any sort of research on it or have taken a class. I'm going to remember two major events that took place. Or one of them is probably going to be the Iran-Contra scandal. So this was an event which took place in sort of the mid to late 80s, in the middle of the war between Iran and Iraq, in which arms were being sold to both countries by the U.S. during the Reagan administration. And a leading figure of that was a man named Oliver North. The other thing you're going to remember is the Iran hostage crisis. The Iran hostage crisis, to summarize it, is, and this is really, really surface level, so I'm not going really super deep into this, is a group of Iranian students and activists and protesters stormed the U.S. embassy and took captive a number of U.S. embassy workers, from high-level diplomats to people working in secretarial or administrative roles, and held them, most of them, as hostages, as prisoners for over 400 days. I want to say 444 days. I don't have that quite right, I'm sure. But essentially for over a year. And these students, they were referred to as students actually in the media, but these Iranian protesters held these hostages under various levels of duress. Something that is not spoken about that much, but is sort of somewhat known and is the main theme of this book, is that there were 6 members of the U.S. embassy who managed to evade capture. This book focuses on these 6 members. So they evaded capture. And so a lot of the book is focused on, first, how they evaded capture, where they hid, and where they were held, ultimately held while waiting extraction. So that's one part of the book. The other part of the book is the part of the book that is the CIA operation designed by Antonio Mendez in order to extricate these American diplomats. The word that Tony Mendez uses specifically is exfiltration. And this is something that he was a specialist at. So a good amount of this book is actually spent on how Tony Mendez became a member of the CIA. And it's a really interesting story. So Antonio Mendez was an artist. He passed away not that long ago, but he was an artist, a very artistic person who answered an ad in a newspaper for a job in the U.S. government as an artist. Now, what this was this special operation or the special division in the CIA called OTS. So these are technical services, the Office for Technical Services. This is where a number of sort of technical specialists were brought together because of their special skills. And one of the things that Antonio Mendez was really good at, one of the reasons why he was hired for this role, is because of his ability to make forgeries, whether it's forging signatures or forging IDs or documents, which is kind of crazy when you think about it, because this is something that we think of as like, oh, this is kind of an illegal activity. But this was also an asset for the CIA. Over the course of Antonio Mendez's career, he sort of rose up the ranks with the CIA. He did special operations, he did field work, and then he oversaw an office of technicians who also worked with similar skill sets as to the one that he had. The main idea, the main plan that he hatched up was to, in order to extricate these 6 diplomats, was to create a false production company in which himself and other operatives pretended to be members of this or employees of this production company, all of whom had special skills. Like one person did script writing, another person was a cinematographer, another person was a producer, and all of these people had to take on these roles, including the 6 diplomats. And so that's essentially the second part of the book focuses on that aspect of their extrication or exfiltration, their sort of their roles in becoming these sort of taking on these false, almost spy-like characters, and these were people who are not used to having to do this. So it's actually quite fascinating. First of all, there's this whole idea of the confidence man. And this is something that is sort of something that's kind of flown around. I've heard of it in other contexts where like these spies are confidence men. They sort of, in order to get through things, they have to act very confidently in order to convince various sort of officials in these other countries, to convince them that they are indeed who they are. A big part of this is actually the creation of disguises. So you've seen this in Hollywood films, or you see this sort of spy, or you see this character who does something, and then they kind of peel off this mask that looked really real, and it turns out it's a total mask, and they're actually a different person. You see this with like Mission Impossible films and other spy films, and this is something that Tony Mendez actually did. He actually specialized in this. There's an anecdote in the book in which Antonio Mendez describes this actual exfiltration of an Iranian general that is codenamed Raptor. This person became an informant for the CIA in Iran and needed extraction from Iran. And in order to do this, Tony Mendez creates this whole persona, this disguise to get this figure, Raptor, out of the country. Some interesting things that come through is really how this happens. So there's this idea maybe, and even Tony Mendez even talks about this, that people maybe get on boats and row through rivers, or they cross through border crossings and all this stuff. But actually, really the main way that these exfiltrations take place is very sort of prosaic. It's just through the airport. They create false passports, they create disguises, personas, and these individuals are then literally taken to the airport, and they go through the very prosaic process of talking to customs agents and getting through different police agents in order to get through the airport and get on a plane and leave. And Raptor, this figure, it becomes almost like a case study in how you do this. And this is described very early in the book. And it's very fascinating because Raptor, even though he's an Iranian general and has trained people, and you think this is kind of a tough guy and cold-blooded, but he kind of goes through this like terrible panic at the moment that he is to be exfiltrated by Tony Mendez, to such a degree that Tony Mendez has to step in and literally kind of almost like hold him by the elbow and just walk him out. So it's very fascinating. And a lot of the tension in the book comes from if this trained general really struggled through it, how will these sort of untrained administrative functionaries be able to do it as well? They all have to take on these personas of being these sort of Hollywood people, Hollywood producers and scriptwriters and directors or whatever. They have to sort of take on these personas that are kind of even also outsized personas. And like I said, this is how tension is built in the book. There's a couple of interesting things that I learned from the book. Obviously, it's the actual operative operations that the CIA undertook in order to run their spy operations, and this is a spy operation. Another thing is how the airport sort of functions and how you deal with the airport and different officials in the airport. Things about how stamps and signatures have to be done, and how stamps change from period to period. And so all of these things are actually talked about in great detail in this book, and it's really, really fascinating. Another thing that I thought was really interesting and that I wasn't really quite cognizant of is how hyper-focused Iran was on America as the outside evil. So these 6 American diplomats essentially hid in the Canadian embassy for weeks. And so the Iranian protesters were really, really focused on the American embassy and capturing these American spies, because they thought that everyone working in an American embassy was a spy. And they were really focused on that, and essentially left other Western embassies totally untouched. So no protests against the Canadian embassy, no protests against the Swedish embassy, no protest, apparently maybe some protests with the British embassy, but there doesn't seem to be much of a focus on that. It's really the American embassy that they were very focused on, and American intervention in Iran. So I found that really fascinating. So that's something that I learned in reading this book. So in terms of where I kind of place, like, do I say this is required reading or suggested? It's really hard to say. Um, I would say that if you want to get a sort of whole narrative, and this is again coming from, admittedly, from a Western point of view, of the Iranian Revolution and the U.S. involvement in it, I would say this is recommended. It's a sort of anecdotal story. It's a sort of side story to a bigger story, and it sort of helps augment the other things you might learn or know from reading other books. It's kind of great if you're into spy books, because it is a spy book, like a John le Carré book, for instance, but it happened for real, and it's written by a person who really did this. It's also really cinematic. It's a book. As you read it, you sort of think, yeah, this can be a film, and of course, it was a film. It was a very famous and well-received film, and so I say this is kind of a great book to read for that purpose. It also, there's other sort of there's also other things that kind of fill out the story overall. There's also a great documentary, a docuseries right now on HBO called Hostage, or Hostages, which show you a lot of what happened during this period of time. But of course, a lot of this stuff is omitted because these 6 Americans. It was known that they had escaped capture, but it wasn't really well known, and so a lot of that is often left out of the narrative of the hostage crisis. Another really interesting thing is the Canadian involvement in this as well. So I think this is something that's often lost, especially in American narrative of operations. You forget that other people are involved, and sometimes other nations are involved. I think there's a tendency to view things from a sort of American exceptionalist point of view, and I think that's fair, because there are a lot of things that the U.S. has done that really is kind of exceptional in the overall arc and story of these world events. But Canada was really heavily involved. For one thing, Canada approved the issuance of Canadian passports for these Americans. So these Americans ended up traveling with Canadian passports, even though they weren't Canadians. And something to touch on in the book is, would have the U.S. done the same for Canadian citizens if the roles were reversed? It's just sort of unknown. So there's a lot of things that this book kind of fills in. So I say this is not required, but highly recommended. It's really a great book to kind of fill out the story. And Iran is a very complex story. It's from ancient times to modern times, and so there's so many books that you can read on this subject, and so a lot of which I'm going to be talking about in the coming weeks and months. But this is definitely one of them, and so I would add this to the list along with reading Lolita and King of Kings, and there's a bunch of others. So recommended book. Argo, How the CIA and Hollywood Pulled Off the Most Audacious Rescue in History.
If you made it this far, make sure to hit that subscribe button so that you are notified of any upcoming episodes. It's free for you, but it means the world to us.